Hello. The goal of this video is to discuss surveys, and in particular, why surveys can be confusing for many autistic individuals and ways to make them more accessible. A while ago, I read a story of a young autistic woman who was being assessed for schizophrenia. And one of the questions that was given to her as part of this assessment was whether or not she hears sounds that other people can't hear. And she answered yes, but it wasn't because she was having auditory hallucinations. Everything she was hearing was sort of a real sound in her environment. The reason she answered yes was because her hearing is very sensitive and she's able to hear faint background noises or distant conversations in the background that her family and friends can't hear. And so, technically speaking, she does hear things that others don't hear. And unfortunately, this sort of trend with surveys where a literal interpretation or an interpretation that an autistic person might be more likely to have could potentially lead to false positives or false negatives. Most surveys are really geared towards predominantly non-autistic individuals. And so I think it's really interesting to consider how surveys can be adapted to be more accessible for autistic people and hopefully mitigate this issue of false positives or false negatives occurring. And also hopefully save the participants some stress or confusion when filling out surveys. So I was really excited to come across an article recently. The study name is Creating Accessible Survey Instruments for Use in Autistic Adults and People with Intellectual Disability, Lessons Learned and Recommendations. And as the name suggests, the study does this sort of review of several other studies throughout 2006 to 2019 and focused on how each of those studies adapted individual tools to be better, better suited for autistic participants or autistic people taking these surveys. And then they picked out these common themes. So common themes for what in the survey was initially causing confusion for the autistic participants and what made that better. And at the end, I think the study had some really compelling results where they give several practical takeaways for what's causing confusion in surveys and what can be done to make it better. One of the areas that they discussed was anxiety. A lot of autistic individuals do experience heightened concern or anxiety over precision or accuracy when taking surveys. And that's tricky because a lot of times surveys are not designed for total precision. You maybe have to just kind of approximate between, approximate between two answers, which one is slightly better for your situation, even though neither of them fit it exactly. Or in some cases, maybe the exact answer changes depending on the context or the specifics of the situation. So it's hard to give a perfectly reliable answer. Some suggestions they had for mitigating this anxiety in surveys and also potentially allowing people the chance to clarify and give more detail as needed is firstly, people making surveys could state in the instructions that something to the effect of it's okay if the answers aren't perfect, just giving your best guess is enough. But in addition, you could potentially add a comment box under questions. So if someone feels like they're stuck and they have to answer a question, but none of the answers fit, they can just put their best guess and add clarification below. This was not in the paper, but a personal idea that I had that may potentially work as well is to just simply include an extra box that someone can check, indicating that they guessed on the question or that they're not confident in their answer. I thought that could be maybe similar to a comment box, but perhaps a little bit faster for some people. I wasn't sure if some people might see a comment box and then feel obligated to list everything or to provide detailed clarification just because the comment box is there. So potentially a checkbox instead could be a good option for some people. Another common theme that came up in the paper was question wording. So there can be conflicting needs here, right? Some people prefer shorter questions and find shorter questions easier to read, whereas other people want more detail and clarification with a question. I find that in general, autistic people often kind of are a bimodal distribution in some ways. We have people who are very sensory seeking and very sensory sensitive. People I think are much more towards the blunt or straightforward or concise style of communication, and others who want a lot of clarification and detail. So in a way, I think that designing an autism inclusive survey is a really exciting task, because if you can meet the very varied needs of the autistic community in a survey, you're probably going to meet the needs of the general population as well, because most people are probably going to fall in between those two needs. But anyways, the catch is that how do we provide enough clarification for those who want that, but also keep the questions short enough that people who want shorter questions don't feel overwhelmed? One potential solution they came up with was to start with a relatively simple question, and then to potentially add hot links or something else that a person can click on to see more information or examples. So suppose you want to assess whether someone is having disrupted sleep. You could ask them whether their sleep is often disrupted, and then you could also include a link to what that means. For example, are you counting nightmares? Are you counting frequently waking up from sleep? Does it count if someone has a disruption or a disturbance in sleep or difficulty related to sleep prior to falling asleep? So for example, if they take a long time to fall asleep or have a lot of difficulty getting up, does that count as a disruption? Including those specific examples in a separate link that people can click on if they want to, but don't necessarily have to see, can be really beneficial for that. So the third topic that was brought up by the researchers was questions with Likert scales. So this could include questions with answers on a scale of 1 to 5 or a scale of 1 to 10. And it also includes questions that have answers like always, usually, sometimes, or never. So where you have to kind of quantize your answer into 4 possible options. And the researchers had noted that these can be pretty confusing. For example, someone might not know what is meant by sometimes, what is meant by usually. Adding percentages or visuals can help people understand. Maybe sometimes means just 10% of the time in that case. Maybe sometimes means 33% of the time. Whatever it is, adding that information in can make things clearer. And personally, I feel like there's still a bit of confusion because always and never are such strong answers, and it's relatively rare to think of something that happens always 100% of the time. I think almost always is going to tend to be a much better answer in most cases. For example, one questionnaire asks whether the person, the question that you're supposed to respond to is, I won't eat unless I can wash my hands. And the options are always, sometimes, or never. Even if someone washes their hands virtually every time before eating, you can probably imagine a hypothetical where maybe you wouldn't need to, maybe you just wash your hands shortly before that, or maybe you don't have access to washing your hands, but you're extremely hungry. I think if you interpret this from like a very technical standpoint, always and never just become such strong options that I feel like it would probably be easier for researchers to drop them. It would maybe increase accuracy. Even getting away from hypotheticals, there's such a large gap between sometimes and never. If something has happened for a person maybe once in their life or once in the past year, it's not technically never because it has happened. But if sometimes is meant to be, you know, referring to something that happens occasionally, perhaps more than once, it doesn't really fit that either. So before going into specific examples of common autistic experiences with tools and ways that mental health screenings for depression and suicidality have been adapted for autistic individuals, I wanted to just add a short note on plain language and overall complexity of surveys. For some people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the memory component that's required in a lot of surveys can be very challenging, no matter how it's worded. For example, asking someone to remember how often things have happened in the past month, how often they've happened in the past year, requires you to do a lot of recall over that time period, which can be challenging. And even beyond that, the reading level of some questions might be inaccessible. So One very specific tool that I think is really neat and I wish was more broadly shared with everyone, whether they're creating surveys or not, just because I think it can be so instructive, is the Flesch Kincaid calculator. So this is available online. I think there's probably a few different versions or links to it online. And you can just copy and paste whatever text you want to use or send to someone, and it will spit out the reading level for you. And I find that sort of playing around with this calculator for a while helps to give a better sense of what changes to a text and what changes to sentence structure or other aspects of writing shift the reading level and in what direction. And if you work with this calculator a little bit, it starts to sort of teach you, at least as a beginning step, what plain language is and what those common changes you can make towards plain language will be. And even in situations where you're not necessarily able to pull up the calculator and type everything you want to say before saying it, the common, I guess, themes that you gather from working with the calculator can help you just learn how to translate things into plain language in general. So definitely a very neat tool. And I'll try and put a link to that below the video as well. But, I think beyond just conveying the content of a question clearly, there's a broader point of how do we adapt the content itself when needed? To give an example, so often when we go to the doctor, we're asked to rate our pain on a scale of 1 to 10. And even if someone completely understands the question and completely understands how the scale is meant to work, that can still be very difficult depending on a few things. For example, if the person has sensory processing differences, they might tend to feel much more pain than would be typical or much less pain than would be typical with an illness or injury. And that can unfortunately result in their diagnosis being overlooked if they're getting a much lower number than expected. Or in some cases, it might lead them to be treated not very well by medical staff who feel like they're overreacting, even though they're just in a higher amount of pain because of their sensory processing. Likewise, if you don't have very strong interoception or sense of what you're feeling, that question can be really tricky to answer because you might not even know what number corresponds to what you're feeling. So in this case, maybe adapting the questions to something a little bit more concrete, not necessarily what are you feeling, but how is this impacting your life? To the extent that you are able to feel pain, when is it most common? What tends to make it worse? What tends to make it better? I'm obviously not a doctor. These are just examples of questions that might be easier for someone to identify than trying to sort of pick out where on a scale their pain might fall, and potentially in some cases trying to also match that to what they think the expected answer for that is if their sensory processing is going to be different than what's typical. Likewise, kind of extending that point about interoception, identifying emotions can sometimes be challenging, and that is often going to be a barrier for mental health questionnaires, for example, or quality of life questionnaires that are really focused on how you've been feeling or how you've been feeling in the past few weeks. Some examples of ways that a depression screening has become more tailored towards autistic individuals is including specific questions about autistic experiences that aren't necessarily precisely asking the person to identify emotions themselves. So do you have reduced interest in special interests or intense interests? Do you have an increased sensory sensitivity? Do you find it harder to mask than usual? Or do you find it harder to sort of suppress autistic traits in situations where you feel like you're expected to? For those who do mask, do you need to fidget or stim more than usual in order to feel okay? Those are examples of specific kind of concrete questions that are really tailored towards autistic individuals. With the suicidality screening, there are adapted versions of the suicidality tool that have asked the person, unfortunately, this screening probably is not adapted towards people with intellectual disabilities or people who may find it more challenging to remember the full portion of the past couple of weeks. But they do ask how often you've had intense thoughts about ending your life and how long these thoughts last. So I think this question really captures a phenomena of rumination that may be more common in autistic individuals. And I think that more broadly, these changes point to the need for autistic individuals to be involved in adapting tools and certainly ideally involved in the development of tools from the beginning. Because otherwise, even with the language adaptations and the question adaptations, we might be overlooking some key questions that should be added that point to unique autistic experiences or experiences that are relatively more unique to autistic people. And we might also be including questions that just aren't going to be that accurate in autistic people, even if they're understood well. And I think kind of a final point on this is that some experiences, which might be very much intertwined for most people, might not be as intertwined for autistic people. So kind of going back to the 2020 study that's done so much work on autism and screenings, they give an example of whether an autistic person is understood by others. So whether they feel like their communication to another person is being understood, and whether they feel like they're understanding the other person's communication. For a lot of people, these are just assumed to be kind of the same things. Like how well did communication go is assumed to mean how well you both are understanding each other. But for quite a few autistic people, we might feel like we're probably understanding the other person fairly well, but they aren't understanding our communication, or potentially vice versa. So kind of separating some of these concepts can be beneficial too. Another example could be emotional distress and hope. I find that it's often assumed in mental health screenings that if someone is feeling more emotional distress, they'll be feeling less hope. And personally, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think someone can have a lot of hope for the world in general, maybe even hope for their own situation some point in the future, and can still be in a lot of pain or distress in that moment. And finally, and anecdotally, one of the comments that I've heard most often, not necessarily only from autistic individuals, but also from parents of autistic individuals, is that generally framing items in a way that's as neutral as possible and that's not introducing sort of extra value judgments can be really helpful, both for the person taking the screening, but also just for the accuracy of the screening. For example, if you're trying to assess whether someone has social communication differences, maybe asking it in that way can give you a more reliable result. And also is probably just a generally more respectful way to phrase it. Sometimes the questions use the word inappropriate, so like, does a child socialize inappropriately? Are there problems with socialization? That can be tricky because if this is, for example, a parent filled out questionnaire, the parent might know that the child does socialize differently, but if they don't consider that difference to be inappropriate or a problem, then they're kind of stuck in answering the questions. And so I think, again, lots of room for adaptations for a broad variety of surveys. And I'd be really curious to hear anyone's thoughts or experience designing surveys, taking surveys, what was confusing, what you like in a survey, or what type of questions are the most helpful. And thank you very much for watching this video on a relatively specific topic that I hope is of some interest. Take care.